Indigenous Afro-American DNA is haplogroup R1. In this video, we will talk about genetics. Afro-Americans are indigenous to North America. We are indigenous because our ancestors were Black Native Americans, Black Europeans, and Sub-Saharan Africans. Most geneticists claim that Afro-Americans are not Native Americans because they say we don't carry Native American genes. This is a lie, because Mongoloid Native Americans and Afro-Americans carry genes that originated in Africa and are still carried by Africans today. The Afro-American populations contain considerable heterozygosity. Because of the diverse origins of these populations and gene flows from various geographical regions in Africa and the Americas, leading to the rise of Afro-American and African populations. For purposes of this, we will discuss only mtDNA and Y chromosome markers, which are primarily called haplogroups. This will allow us to look at the rich genetic heritage of Afro-Americans. DNA carries genetic information that is passed down from mothers and fathers to their daughters and sons, from generation to generation. We inherit mtDNA from our mothers and Y chromosome DNA from our fathers. A haplogroup is similar to a large family that share specific characteristics unique to that family. There are two families of haplogroups, mtDNA and Y chromosome DNA. Haplogroups are assigned a capital letter and a number to designate a branch of a particular mitochondrial or Y chromosome DNA tree. Each haplogroup has subclades that represent the common ancestry of individuals. The names of haplogroups are arbitrary. They usually begin with a capital letter that has a number attached to it. For example, R1. To distinguish subgroups of a lineage, lowercase letters and numbers are assigned to haplogroups. For example, R1B1A. Each haplogroup is assigned an age. The age of an haplogroup is an approximate age. The age assigned to a haplogroup is not an exact age for that haplogroup. It is just an estimate based on statistical modeling. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA that is related to the maternal or female side. The mtDNA is passed on from the parent to their offspring. The mtDNA provides information on the maternal line of the individual. Thusly, maternal haplogroups are haplogroups passed down from the mother. The Y chromosome DNA is passed from father to son only. This is because only males possess the Y chromosome. As a result, the Y chromosome represents the paternal line. If anyone remembers the PBS special on blacks and DNA, it was noted that although Henry Louis Gates' family of Harvard University claimed they had an Indian heritage, the DNA of Gates was found to be 60% European ancestry, i.e. it belonged to haplogroup R1, and 34% African. Because Gates carried 60% R1 haplogroup, he believed his ancestors were mainly Europeans. This was a false analogy, because R1 is a Black Native American and African haplogroup. In this same special, Oprah had Indian genes because she carried haplogroup A, which is considered to be a Native American haplogroup, even though the Mandi speakers and Africans in Southwest Africa also carry mtDNA. People found this a joke because Oprah was dark-skinned while Gates' family was light-skinned. They felt this was a joke because after 100 years of seeing pictures of the Apache Indians in cowboy movies, We have been conditioned to believe that the only Indians or Native Americans in the United States were light-skinned and not copper-colored. Now we know that many North American Native Americans carry haplogroup R. This means that Gates' parents were right. They do have Indian ancestry. But since Europeans promote the idea that the only carriers of haplogroup R are European, Gates felt he had found his true origins in Europe. It is said that, like African brothers, Black Native Americans organized themselves into small individual tribal villages. Organized as individual tribes and nations made it possible for Europeans to use divide and rule tactics to have the Indians fight and enslave each other. North American Europeans did enslave Indians during wars, especially in New England. For example, the Pequot War, King Philip's War. And in the Southeast, where they had the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee War and Natchez Wars. These wars were wars between the white Englishmen and the Black Native Americans, just to name a few. But ordinarily, Europeans, especially the English and French, purchased their Indian slaves from other Indians. The Black Native American and Mongoloid Native American tribes would then organize themselves into confederations to meet threats from enemy Indian tribes. These confederations were made up of Black and Mongoloid Native Americans. For example, the Iroquois were actually not a people, but a confederation of 6 Native American nations: the Cayuga, Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, and Tuscarora. In terms of power, they were perhaps the most formidable Native American group in North America, and the most represented in the imaginative works of European settlers, controlling at their zenith a territory covering Massachusetts to Ohio, on into Quebec and Ontario, and then south down to Kentucky. Much of what is now Georgia was a stronghold of Black Native Americans. These blacks lived predominantly from the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina, southward as far as St. Augustine, Florida. The vast majority of Native Americans lived in California or along the eastern seaboard in North America. They belonged to many confederations, including the Muskogean and Algonquin. Some of their tribal names include Choctaw, Tuscarora, Sokolon, Potawatomi, Tamacra, Nanticoke, Kashida, Couche, Seminoles, and Yamasee, to name a few. The Black Native American tribes mainly belonged to the Iroquois, Muskogean, and Algonquin confederacies. But these confederacies, the Iroquois, Muskogean, and Algonquin, are usually depicted as solely confederations of Mongoloid Indians. This is a lie. Africans are closely genetically related to Mongoloid Native Americans. In my new book, We Are Not Just Africans, I tell the actual history of the Black Indians from prehistory to the Emancipation Proclamation. There were 5 major migrations of blacks into the Americas. The first were probably the Australian-type blacks who settled Brazil 100,000 years ago. But they did not come to America from Australia because of the Ice Age. They came to America from North Africa. That's right. The first blacks that came to America 100,000 years ago came from Africa. The second group of blacks entered the Western Hemisphere were the Khoisan. The Khoisan, who today live in South Africa, they arrived in South America 30 to 45,000 years ago. By 15,000 BC, the Khoisan had introduced what's called Solutrean culture to North America. The Khoisan were followed by the Anu, or Pygmy people, after 10,000 BC. Other Africans made numerous migrations to America beginning around 2000 BC. Finally, during the Atlantic slave trade, millions of blacks were taken to the Americans by European slavers. There is plenty of genetic evidence of an African presence in the Americas. First of all, you had to get away from the idea that blacks left Africa only 60,000 years ago. There were other migrations out of Africa. For example, the Khoisan, who founded the Grimaldi or Ignacian culture in Europe, left Africa around 30,000 years ago. And the Pygmy people, who are usually referred to as the Seed people or Anu, left Africa between 20 and 15,000 years ago. The Pygmy people, as evidence of their presence on every continent, had an extensive civilization in the past, even though today they are hunter-gatherers. The major American Indian male lineage include R1, CD, and Q3. There is evidence of African admixture in the American Y chromosome haplogroups. The QY haplogroup has the highest frequency among indigenous Mexicans. The frequency of haplogroup Q varies from a high of 54% for Q M243 and a low of 46% for QM. African Y chromosomes are associated with YAP plus and 9BP. The YAP A is associated with what's called the AG transition at the point of DYS271. It is here found among Native Americans. The YAP plus individuals include the Miche speakers. YAP plus is often present in haplogroups C and D. So as you can see, C and D, Y chromosomes, carry many molecules of what's called transitions that go back to an African heritage. The DYS271 transition is of African origin. The DSY271 allele insertion is found only in chromosomes bearing allele insertion YAP+, at locus DYS287. The DYS271 transition was found among Wayu, Zenu, and Izanu. The Mexican Native American Y chromosome bearing the African marker is resident in haplogroups C and D. So as you can see, given the fact that they're carrying the YAP insertions and 9BP, they're not really different from African Americans. They're carrying our genes. RM173 is also found in Mexico. Haplogroups R and Q are part of the CT macro group, which dates back 56,000 years ago. Haplogroup R branches from haplogroup Q with the SNP M242. The CT haplogroup has SNP and mutation M168, along with P and M94. Haplogroup P, M45, has two branches, Q M242 and R M207, which share the common markers M45. M45 The predominant haplogroup Y chromosome in South America among Native Americans is Q. But Native Americans in North America carry a high frequency of R M173. The predominant Y chromosome in North America is R M173. R M173 is found only in the northeastern United States, along with mtDNA haplogroup X. Both haplogroups are found in Africa, but are absent in Siberia. The R haplogroup is carried by Mexicans. The frequency of R varies from Tarahumara, 5.6%, Otomi, 14.3%, Yucatec Maya, 10.5%. There's also a high frequency of haplogroup R among the Shao and Chantel Maya, which stood at around 15%. There's no way the first Americans could have come from Asia, because the Beringa Passage between Asia and the American continent did not become passable until after 12,000 years ago. But as early as 40,000 years ago, there were African American communities in South America. In fact, the first Africans got here around 100,000 years ago. The MTD haplogroups A2, B2, and X2 are daughter class of haplogroup N. Since haplogroup N is carried by the Khoisan, this suggests an early presence of this population in the Americas, just like they were in Europe, and supports an early expansion into the Americas. By 15,000 years ago, we have a new population arriving in the Americas, the Ainu. These pygmies probably were the first to introduce Y chromosome RB into the Americas. Other West African groups brought R1 and mtDNA to the Americas between 2000 BC and 1300 AD. We also had to remember that some of the so-called Paleo-Americans also called R1b, so it's a good possibility that the Khoisan introduced R2. The foundational mtDNA lineages for Mexican Indians are lineages A, B, C, and D. The frequencies of these lineages vary among population groups. For example, whereas lineages A, B, and C were present among Maya at Quintana Roo and Copan, we find that some Maya didn't carry A and B. This supports Carolina Bonetta et al.'s view that heterogeneity is a major characteristic of Mexican populations. It is interesting to note that the speakers of the Miche and Mandi languages of Africa share many linguistic features and the mtDNA haplogroup. African ancestry has been found among indigenous groups throughout the Americas. It is very interesting that although in a sense the Indians carry many mtDNA haplogroups that are also carried by Africans, we still had to come to the main haplogroup that identifies Afro-Americans as Native Americans or indigenous people. And this haplogroup again is Y chromosome M173. Whereas only between 8% and 10% of M173 is carried by Eurasians, 82% of the carriers of Y chromosome are found in various parts of West, Central, East, South Africa. It is very interesting that the presence of R M173 is found among many American Indian groups. For example, in North America, among the Algonquin groups such as the Ojibwe, 79% carry R173. Among the Chippewyans, 62%. Seminoles, 50%, Cherokee, 47%, Dogriff, 40%, and Papago, 38%. All of these Indians have long associated with Africans, and they also, in a sense, have mated with black Native Americans, and that's why they carry R173. The most predominant Y chromosome of Native Americans in North America is RM173. RM173 is found in the northeastern and southwestern parts of the United States, along with mtDNA haplogroups X, which is at 25%. Both haplogroups are found in Africa. The R1 haplogroup is found throughout Africa, and it is carried by many groups. The most important thing to remember about the R1 M173 haplogroup in Africa is that it is a pristine form of R1 M173. Since it's the pristine form, that means that this is the highest or the richest characteristic of R1 M173. Not found in Europe, not found in Asia, but found in Africa. The frequency of Y chromosome R1 M173 in Africa ranges between 7 and 95%, and averages 39.5%. The RM173 chromosome is found in Africa in two forms. It can be called either V88 or it is RM269. The literature provides us with the data to critically examine the distribution of R1 M73. The Y chromosome V88 has its highest frequency among Chadic speakers, while carriers of V88 among Niger-Congo speakers, predominantly Bantu, range between 2 to 66%. This is very interesting because many of the sub-Saharan slaves brought to the New World were Niger-Congo speakers. Haplogroup V88 includes the mutations M18, V35, and V7. Cruciano et al. Revealed that our V88 is also carried by Eurasians, including distinctive mutations M18, V35, and V7. What is most shocking is that Kinseville, in a paper published in 2017, also noted that there were many people who carried V88 back during the Neolithic in Europe. So this shows, in the sense that at an early time, Africans had migrated into Europe. We also find M269. It's very interesting that we find M269 in Africa, because M269 is usually supposed to be only carried by Europeans, but this is false. We know, in a sense, that M269 is also carried by many black folk, and carrying the pygmies, Indians, and whatever. But the most important thing to remember too is that our M269 and V88 was reintroduced into Europe during the Islamic conquest. You see, we find, in a sense, that many of the so-called Moors who originated in Africa and who attacked Europe, Iberia, in 711 AD were black Muslims from West Africa. And these black Muslims were probably also some of the introducers of the haplogroup M269 into Europe. Okay, another interesting Y chromosome found in the Americas is haplogroup A1. Haplogroup A1 is common to many sub-Saharan Africans, including the Pygmy, Andean, etc. And yet, people will tell you that when Native Americans carry this haplogroup, it is only a Native American haplogroup. No, it is an African haplogroup. In fact, every haplogroup that are carried by people around the world originate in Africa. But let's look at this whole idea of when did black Native Americans and sub-Saharan Africans met. We know the first slaves in the Americas were not Africans. These were black Native Americans, indigenous people. These black Native Americans, indigenous to the Americas, were made slaves, and they worked on many of the plantations. But as more and more Europeans opened up more farms, they did not have enough black Native Americans to work on these farms. So what they began to do is they began to bring sub-Saharan Africans over here. As a result, we find that many sub-Saharan African slaves, the first ones brought to America, were brought to America by the Spanish. But we see that as early as 1500, these runaway sub-Saharan slaves joined black Native American and Mongoloid Native American communities. And as they moved in the 1500s from the Spanish colonies into the Carolinas and Florida, they were adopted sub-Saharan Africans by black Native American tribes and Mongoloid tribes. The year 1799 is an important day for Afro-Americans. It was after this date that the interstate slave trade began. During this slave trade, the average slave was sold to another plantation or part of the United States by the age of 5. This is something to keep in mind, that if the slave was sold as early as the age of 5, that's one of the reasons why many black Americans today have forgotten their indigenous heritage. They lost this identity because of the fact that they would sell the black Native Americans who were mating with sub-Saharan Africans at an early age, and they couldn't remember their heritage. This meant a lot of intermarriages. This interstate slave trade made the Afro-American population more homogeneous. Then the pre-1799 population. It became more homogeneous because black Native Americans and sub-Saharan Africans were forced on the plantation to mate. And by being forced on the plantation to mate, they eventually became one population, which today we can call Afro-American. Not African-American, because African-American suggests an origin from Africa, rather than, in a sense, an American origin. We find, in a sense, that as these black people mated and as many black people became free, during slavery that we saw a lot of intermarriage. White people did not marry Native Americans until they moved out to Oklahoma. And yet today, many white people will pretend that they are the real Native Americans because of the fact that they were able to buy into a tribe or they joined the tribe later. The black Native Americans lived on valuable farmlands during the colonial period. The English and Americans wanted this land. This led to violent conflicts between black Native Americans and white Americans. In New England, the black Native Americans were eliminated by slaving, warfare, and forced removal. The French enslaved Native Americans around the Great Lakes, Minnesota, Missouri country, and Louisiana. The Europeans also needed labor to work the fields. The Americans provided the Native American Mongoloids with guns and cheap goods to purchase Native American Indian slaves. Between 1670 and 1720, many black Native Americans were enslaved. The black Native Americans were sold into slavery throughout the 13 colonies, Canada, and also the British West Indies. The majority of black Native Americans sold in slavery by white and Indian slave traders were the Choctaw and Yamasee and other Carolina tribes. A good example of the enslavement and forced removal of black Native Americans is the case of the Yamasees. The Yamasee was a tribe of black Native Americans who originally lived in Carolina and Florida, and also some in southern Georgia, until they were forced to migrate north into South Carolina by the Spanish in the 16th century. The Yamasee were part of the Muskogean Confederacy. This was the confederacy of Mongoloid and black Native Americans. The whites began to steal the Yamasee's land. By 1750, the Yamasee, leading a confederation of other tribes, attacked the whites to drive them off their lands. The Cherokee, who were part of the Muskogean Confederation, mainly a Mongoloid group, broke away and formed an alliance with the British in 1718 and helped defeat the black Native American Yamasees. The Yamasee who were not killed off were sold into slavery. Most of the Yamasee fled back into their ancestral homeland in Florida, which by this time was settled by the Cree. Yamasee were virtually wiped out due to protracted combat with the Creeks, who felt they were trying to take back the land they formerly owned in Florida. Some Yamasee joined the Seminole tribes. In return, the Cherokee took control of Yamasee land, and the Yamasees became known as slaves instead of, in a sense, Native Americans. Due to Indian slavery in North America, black Native American population was absorbed by the larger sub-Saharan African population. Over time, people forgot they had been black Native Americans and Mongoloid Native Americans. In fact, the black Native American heritage and lands rights were stolen by the government, as all blacks in America, no matter their ancestry, were assigned the status of former African slave. Gilead Whitaker in 215 wrote that, as the Indian slave trade gave way to the African slave trade by the late 1700s, by then, over 300 years old, Native American women began to intermarry with imported Africans, producing mixed-race offspring, whose native identities became obscured through time. In the colonial period, to eliminate the landscape of Indians, these mixed-race people simply became known as colored people through bureaucratic erasure in public records. In some cases, such as Virginia, even when people were designated Indians on birth or death certificates or other public records, their records were changed to reflect color. Census takers determined a person's race by their looks, often recorded mixed-race people or black Native Americans simply as black, not Indian. The result is that today there is a population of people of Native American heritage and identity, particularly in the Northwest and the South, who are not recognized by society at large as indigenous people. And they are referred to as freemen and other groups. Whereas English Americans and Native Americans were antagonistic, African slaves had a very intimate relationship with Native Americans. An undetermined number of African slaves fled into Indian territory during slavery. Among the Native American population, sub-Saharan Africans began new lives and married Native American females, Mongoloid Native American females. Among many Native American groups, especially Seminoles, as a result, ex-slave or sub-Saharan males played an important role in the Creek and Seminole nations. Due to the demand for slave labor, more and more Africans came. As more and more sub-Saharan Africans came, they mated with the black Native Americans. In North America, there were so many sub-Saharan Africans among the Iroquois and other northeastern American tribes that in 1726, 1764, and 1765, the governors of colonial New York expected a promise from the Delaware, Huron, and Iroquois Confederation to return these slaves. This should not be a surprise because many of the members of the Iroquois Confederation were black Native Americans. And as you can imagine, these black Native Americans would not sell the sub-Saharan slaves back into slavery. Although black Native American and Mongolian Native American nations gave this promise to the governor, no slaves were ever returned. There are reports of numerous marriages between Native American and sub-Saharan African males. Intermarriages between Native Americans and sub-Saharan Africans populations between British Columbia and New England was especially high. Massachusetts was a major center for Native American and sub-Saharan intermixture. Many sub-Saharan slave males married North American females because the offspring became free. As early as 1763 in places like Martha's Vineyard, Tilburg, Chilliwack, and Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts, almost one-fourth of Native Americans were sub-Saharan males. Isn't it interesting that Martha Vineyard and Chappaquiddick, areas that are today prime territory owned by rich Americans, as you can see, were originally owned by black Native Americans who were forced to leave these areas and whites took them over. Researchers have found the most recent ancestor V88 is 9,000 years old, whereas M69 is only 7,000 years old. What this shows in a sense is that black people were carrying these genes long before the whites were carrying them, and that they took these genes and spread them among the Native Americans. Another group of black people, sub-Saharan Africans, who played an important role in the Americas would have been people from the ancient civilization of Mali. It appears that in 1310, 25 to 80,000 Malians came to America with the Malian Emperor Abubakari. These black people would have also helped spread the R1 haplogroup among Native Americans. Due to the Native American slave trade, many black Native American owners in the West Indies, other Native Americans were forced to work on plantations or sold into slavery. Using a system of divide and rule, the whites were able to get the Indians to capture each other and sell their captives as slaves. Since the ancestors of the black Native Americans had originated in Africa, they began to be identified as slaves, Indians, freemen, and finally colored. And then as a result of bureaucratic erasure in the public records, the former black Native Americans simply became identified as colored, like the former sub-Saharan slaves, instead of Native Americans. Yes, Afro-Americans are an indigenous people. Yes, Afro-Americans are the result of the mixing of Native Americans that were black and Africans from sub-Saharan Africa. As a result, black Native American plus sub-Saharan African equals Afro-American. In conclusion, the presence of the MTD haplogroups M, N, and A, and the Y chromosome haplogroups R1, B, and A1 testify to the ancient presence in the Americas. It testifies to the Afro-American identity as indigenous people. Yes, Afro-Americans are the indigenous people of America. Yes, Afro-Americans continue to carry the genes and haplogroups that our ancestors brought to America. Yes, Afro-Americans are an indigenous people.